All right, we're recording and we're back. So, first proper remote session, which has taken 2 hours to set up.
I think it's actually been more than 2 hours.
Yeah, which is pretty good for us.
It is good for us, but
Yeah.
I'm just gobsmacked every single time that there is just little technological bugs and issues. I'm surprised, just the fact that my mouse stopped working before. I can't believe that still happens. I thought we would have worked all this out by now.
You'd think so, but nah. There's too many interactions with different programs and stuff and the internet and all this. It's too complicated, so something's going to break. It works pretty well when you think about how actually technically difficult all this stuff is to pull together.
Oh, I'm not saying I would have a hope in hell of being able to do any of it. But
you can complain about it.
Complain about it for sure. So what's the go today, mate?
Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, which is a book by the Pixar founder about how to be creative.
Yeah, it's a kind of split autobiography of himself and the development of Pixar, which is a nice little combination. Both a nice little story and a business book.
Yeah, maybe it's more of a memoir about his time at Pixar. But tell us about Ed.
So I was going to ask you though, mate, just before we did that, did you listen to this one or did you read this one?
I listened to this, which I think I've said for almost every book we've done, so people probably think I don't read at all. But I generally do 50% audiobooks, 50% reading. Yeah. In traditional reading. So
yeah, as I said before this, I've made a rule that, at least for myself, that the only books that I will listen to are biographies or fictional narratives or something with narrative, because I just can't consume the more technical stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea, and I think I'll do the same. They're certainly the ones I've most enjoyed on audiobook. Things like American Kingpin or Bad Blood or those type of kind of narrative non-fictions. Because something like this, it is hard to kind of remember all the information.
Yeah, even though there is a bit of a narrative to it, there's a lot of just solid takeaways. And particularly if you want to make some notes for later, can be difficult in the audio form. Not impossible, but just more difficult.
Yeah, for sure.
So Ed was born in 1945. So he's coming of age, and he grew up in Utah. And he was actually in this little close-knit Mormon community when he first, when he was first growing up. And his upbringing was really shaped by his father's upbringing, which he had come from, a dirt farmer with 14 other siblings, 5 of which died. A
dirt farmer?
Yes.
What is that?
I had to look this up. So the way I understand dirt farmer, and I'm sure I'll still be corrected, is they are the ones so a farmer who tends the land and looks after his farm all by himself, basically.
Right. Okay.
Basically, he's the man running the business. He's the man doing all the farming. He's the man that's whatever it is. So
it sounds like you were talking ill of him.
Not talking ill. I think it's just
it's just the word.
I think it's just it's a tough situation to be in. Yeah. When I first heard it, I thought, is this an indication that it's a farmer that can't actually grow anything? And they're just
is he like
playing with dirt,
pushing dirt around?
I think that's what you and I do, mate. We play with dirt.
Yeah. Yeah, earthworks.
Yeah, earthworks, civil. That's a civil joke. So anyway, that was a big influence on his upbringing. And so as a result of his father actually kind of escaping some of that, instilling in his own children this idea of, working for creating whatever it is that you want to create out of your life, and, making an impact that way. And so I think Ed really kind of took that on board, which is pretty exciting. And kind of tied in with all of that is his upbringing was, off the back of World War II, the Great Depression. So there was this real optimism that had been generated after, the inflection point of all those, kind of big negative world events. So everything was kind of looking positive.
Yeah. The baby boomers.
Yeah, the boomers. And so around similar time, there was the big space race that was going on, and this is part of the leading into the Cold War. And so the Soviets launched the Sputnik 1, which was the first artificial satellite to go into orbit. And so America's response was to create the Advanced Research Project Agency, APRA, which I think has actually become DARPA now, with just defense in front. And these are the guys that have, helped the computer revolution, created the internet, or been majorly responsible for the internet, nuclear test detection, rockets, jets, planes, M16s, all that type of stuff. So they've had big responsibility and fingers in a lot of pies. And this is really interesting because this kind of ties back in a little bit later on in Ed's life. So he had a real passion for art that developed in high school.
He loved Walt Disney, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was obsessed by the cartoons.
He was like, it sounded as though he was so impressed by what they do, but he thought that he would never be able to do it himself, which is quite interesting. Or at least he thought he didn't have the technical and dexterity to allow him to be a great animator. But he loved the idea.
He wasn't a great artist as such.
No, but he does say that
in it, like drawing, I mean by that, I guess.
Yes, yeah, which is the repetitive drawing of pictures, certainly back then, to create animations. You're drawing 30 pictures in for every 1 second of film type thing. I couldn't imagine doing that. Certainly haven't got the patience. But he said that the act of committing that object to paper was completely engrossing. And so I think that was a real dawning point for him to, to shape where he was going to head later on. So of course, he did have he felt he had a much more scientific brain. And so he went and studied physics and computer science in 1969. And he was encouraged to enter into computer graphics by Ivan Sutherland. And he was the guy that created the very first head-mounted virtual reality. Now, that's pretty interesting, mate, because back then, 1968, the Oculus Rift is not a new concept.
There you go.
1968.
Just took a long time to get going. Even now, it's not really widely used yet. You wouldn't think they'd quite nailed it.
No, I've had to play with one. Actually, the first time I ever sat down to test one out, and of course, the first thing that happens when they put it on my head, the whole system just drops out. And so that wasn't a good start. But eventually it got going, and it was, because it was quite a noisy room, some of the noise cancelling headphones, it wasn't quite cutting everything out. But it was quite a trippy experience.
You wouldn't want to be walking around.
No, not at all.
We've got them on.
No, it would be, they do like laser tag.
Yeah.
There's like a laser tag, at least in Melbourne, where they do like a zombie escape laser tag thing.
Oh, that's cool.
Where you basically got these goggles on,
yeah,
and you're going around with everyone else with goggles on, but you're kind of just sitting in your little zone, which is pretty interesting.
That's the future.
We're going to have to give that a test run, mate.
Yeah.
So anyway, 1968, although I think it was like wearing a barbell on your head.
Yeah.
At the time. So things have changed. They've gotten a bit lighter. Who else was he exposed to at this time? So there's Professor Sutherland and Dave Evans, who was the chair of the computer science department, allowed their students to work on whatever excited them. So for Ed, he eventually went on to start Pixar. In Ed's class, there was a guy named Jim Clark. He started Silicon Graphics and Netscape. For those that recognise, there was John Warnock, who started Adobe. Alan Kay, who started object-oriented programming. So I suspect it was a pretty inspirational class.
Some pretty smart people.
And this idea of, working on whatever excites them, I think that stuck with Ed. So they trusted them to innovate, and they gave them all kinds of freedom to solve problems how they wanted to, and it gave them a lot of energy. So from his arts background, his interest in arts, he thought that pictures really spoke to him, and so he basically decided that he wanted to kind of cross-pollinate the ideas of his computer science, what he was doing with that, and the interest he had in art. And so by the age of 28, he made his first short animated film. The first short animated film, I should say, which is like digital film. And it was basically a model of his left hand, which he went through this crazy process of covering his hand in plaster and then creating a mold and then putting all these triangular nodes and things on it to kind of turn it into what it would represent as flat surfaces, and then program that into a computer.
Pretty revolutionary at the time.
Hugely much, and so much so that that's in the it's in the various archives and registries of famous things that have happened. So pretty cool. By the age of 28.
Very interesting.
And 29, he was hired by Applicon, which is a company back then. But shortly after, George Lucas actually approached him and to become vice president of Computer Graphics Group that he was involved with. Now, obviously, George Lucas is the guy behind Lucasfilms, Star Wars, etc. So I imagine that was a pretty big thing.
Yeah. He had a fair bit of money by then to throw around.
Yes. And so 1986, at the age of 41, Steve Jobs bought out Lucas's digital division and founded Pixar with Catmull as the chief technology officer. And obviously Pixar is responsible for the likes of Toy Story and Finding Nemo and all those massive animated films that we know of today. Shortly after 2006, Disney acquired Pixar with Bob Iger as the CEO. And I actually note that Bob's, I think he's released a book recently, which we might have to have a look at as well, particularly after getting some insight from this one.
Check that out. Yeah.
And put Catmull and John Lasseter, and John was another guy that Ed had been working with at Lucas, and he was basically the creative brains.
He's the story man.
Yeah, the story man. And I think he's had some recently controversial things going on, but we won't delve into those.
Really, I have to Google that later.
And so obviously, off the back of that, films like Cars and some other, the other big blockbusters of the animated films, become the most
lots of hits,
most successful films of all time. $22 billion in box office revenue, which is unbelievable. And so, go on through the journey of his company, which hopefully we're going to describe a little bit about. And then 2018, Catmull just has announced that, or he announced that he was going to retire from his position. And then obviously that was kind of timed. Actually, he'd released the book a few years earlier. And so he'd kind of written the book, and then I imagine that he was on his way kind of handing over the reins by that point in time. So very exciting life. And we've obviously skipped a big portion of his life, which was the creation of Pixar. But we've kind of glazed over it.
But we'll get into that. So, yeah, and this book's really about that. It's about his journey building Pixar into that incredible film studio that produces hit after hit, and kind of how they do it, and his philosophy around nurturing creativity in teams and in organisations. And it's a very interesting read. So let's get into it. So I guess there are sort of a number of things that stuck out to us that were kind of new or interesting ideas that we learnt from while reading this. But something that was particularly strong, I think, was just what you see in, I suppose, a lot of good companies, is that they figure out what they care about, how to achieve it, and then have the courage to follow it. And so for Pixar, the way Ed describes it was really around trusting the creative process and setting up an organisation that was led by that and put that first and put quality first. So he describes it as a filmmaker-led studio. So they're all practitioners. There's no really kind of hugely corporate people looking over the creatives, They're all really cut from the same cloth and have been involved in that creative process.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. The whole focus was, it wasn't how can we skimp another dollar here, or how can we, cut this bit here. Although that, I'm sure that happens as the organisation grew into a massive beast. But the real focus was always focused on the creative side of things.
Yeah, story is king is a saying that they throw around inside of Pixar. And yeah, quality over time constraints as well. Like some examples, I guess, I think Monsters, Inc. took 5 years to make. They've cut whole films and remade them from the bottom up. Toy Story 2, they did that, and they actually got rid of the directors and started again.
That's pretty inspirational, mate.
Yeah.
Or it would have been unbelievably tough at the time. But can you imagine, after having spent years developing a particular film and then just axing it completely?
Incredibly difficult. He says the right people and the right combination is more important than good ideas. Ideas come from people, not the other way around. So he also decided not to go into the direct-to-video market, which was at the time a huge source of revenue for Disney. Incredibly popular, these sort of VHS videos, or I suppose whether it got to DVDs at that point, but that would sell, animated movies direct to VHS that, you could buy for your kids and watch at home. But they felt that they weren't going to be able to produce the quality that they believed in, and so completely ignored that market.
And that means that their focus was where, mate?
Well, it was in the feature films and making things like Toy Story and Finding Nemo and Monsters, Inc. and A Bug's Life and really, creating a really new, fresh type of deep story and engaging. Like Ratatouille, one of their movies, is one of my favourite movies. It's so I don't know, something about it. It's just so touching. It's ridiculous. And it's about a rat, you know.
The hero's journey, right? The hero's journey.
Yeah, they make it kind of appeal to everyone, and it's a pretty amazing feat. And some of the stuff he talks about in this book is probably why.
Yeah. So you do find that quite a lot of their narratives are centered around, well, I guess most films, but it's very, you know, that hero's journey, which is quite amazing.
Have you started reading The Hero with 1,000 Faces?
No.
Well, I'm listening to it.
Is it a listenable book?
No, I should have bought. I might even just buy it on the Kindle.
Pretty dense.
Because it's dense, yeah. But I learnt a lot already from it. I know it's one of Ray Dalio's favourite books.
Yes.
But it actually inspired Star Wars.
Very interesting.
And a lot of filmmakers have read that book by Joseph Campbell. So it's pretty cool.
It's no doubt one that will be discussed.
Yeah.
Some stage in the future.
So, yeah. I guess like he really kind of round out the point is that, you know, there's a lot of companies that throw around values as a, you know, success, innovation, excellence or whatever, and just throw these words around. And the idea, I guess, is for these values to, I suppose, kind of represent in one word or a sentence a whole heap of ideas and guiding principles and the way things are done within an organisation so that it can be clearly communicated. But there's no real point if they can't back it up. So if the words, you know, excellence, and you're not doing the doing and following it and making really hard decisions that are based on that, then what's the point of even having it in the first place?
It sounds like
easy, and even that's easy to say, right? Like, and that's something he emphasizes is that, hey, following these at times were really bloody difficult, and we didn't always get it right. And you know, I know from being involved in running a business that it is very hard to, at all times, make sure you're aligned with the things that you're saying that you care about, even if that's your intention.
Yes. Oh, it's very much the actions speak a lot louder than words. And there's this term that's getting thrown around a lot, or at least I've seen it a lot in the last, I don't know, year or so, which is that virtue signaling idea. And this is obviously directed more at individuals, but, you know, preaching to have particular behaviors, but are you really acting in a way that suggests that you not just say what you believe, but you act the way that you believe? You know, and, you know, if you're not acting that way, do you actually believe it? Chances are probably not.
Yeah.
And so just scale, and that just scales up, you know, obviously then to an organisation, and I think they've taken that on board in a big way.
Oh, they're very aligned. What's the handle and suitcase that he talks about? Metaphor.
Yeah. So this basically ties into that idea, but I think it has broader connotations to, you know, processes in general and taking on particular projects or ideas. So the suitcase represents all that has gone into the formation of the phrase. So the experience, the deep wisdom, the truths that emerge from the struggle. And too often we grab the handle and without realising it, walk off without the suitcase. What's more, we don't even think about what we've left behind. And it's up to the individual to remember that it is okay to use the handle just as long as you don't forget the suitcase.
Yeah, it's pretty clever. It's a nice representation of what he's talking about.
Well, he's talking just simply about, like, you know, empty virtue signaling. You know, that's exactly what it is. And so it's there's a all hat, no cattle, I think is another little phrase to represent it.
Another point is that I think that's lost sometimes is that you need to actually have quite a profitable business to be able to follow some of these values to the fullest extent. Is that it's not always just that you're misaligned or something like that. It's that you need to actually build in money to be able to spend on things like making Toy Story 2 for a long time, or scrapping it, or making Monsters Inc. for 5 years. That ain't cheap, right? So the business model's got to allow for you to actually do these things. So if you're going to make a really high quality product, you need to make sure you're selling it for a lot too, so that you can continue to invest in your values that create such a good product too.
Yeah.
There's a commercial aspect behind it as well.
I see that.
You need time. They take time.
Yeah. I see that as very much in the space of that disconnect between, by its nature, the format lends itself to being, input is disconnected from, what potential output can be realized.
So by that you mean the one movie can be duplicated a bazillion times and sold infinitely.
Yeah, correct.
So
if it strikes a chord.
Terrible movie can take the same amount of time as a good movie, but sell very different amounts of volumes.
Correct. Yeah.
Volumes of
can be completely hit or miss. Or you see it in this, certainly in the startup space, people working on an idea for years, developing code or some app or a platform, and then it's nothing. But at the same time, that app could also be the next Facebook.
Yeah. So let's get into his creative process and what he believes. I think this rule of thumb was interesting for me to kind of sum up partly his approach. As he says, when we impose any limits or procedures, we should ask ourselves how they will aid in enabling people to respond creatively. If the answer is that they won't, then the proposal are ill-suited to the task at hand. So he talks a lot about not worrying too much about efficiency, and that creativity, much like he was able to work on whatever he wanted at early in his career when he was a kind of an academic, he's able to let sort of things evolve naturally, and planned innovation doesn't work. So he's not too worried about being super efficient all the time. He's willing to let things kind of happen and let creativity kind of blossom out of from the bottom up.
Yeah, I saw that. So I see that as they still stick to their process, right? But when the process is creating boundaries or limits on the way in which something is done, that's when things are kind of pushed outside. So it's kind of like when the creativity doesn't have the space to do what it needs to do, that's when it's a problem.
Space is the key word. It needs space to just happen, It can't be done on a timeline necessarily all the time.
You meditate, don't you, Matt?
I do.
Do you find that when you're meditating, or when you're lying in bed, or obviously when you're in the shower, any of those times, there's just ideas that strike you, just great ideas?
It's interesting. Sometimes I find that you kind of make connections in funny moments, between things that just kind of pop up. And it's a skill to kind of that I'm working on to try and recognize those and recognize how I'm feeling when those things happen, and then write them down.
That's the key.
Because they can go quickly.
They go as quick as they bloody arrive. And obviously, if I'm in a meditation, I'm not going to stop doing the meditation. Or if I'm in the shower, I haven't got a notepad and pen handy. Although I have seen in those gimmick stores that you can buy shower notepad and pen, waterproof. I think we actually stayed in an Airbnb once, where I think the host had one of those sitting in their shower, and it had some notes and things screwed on it. It didn't look
okay.
It wasn't the most clear of notes.
I see.
It's right. Kind of like an
it'd be hard to write on something like that.
Very, very strange. But if he captures the idea of the century on that bit of paper, mate, who knows?
That's right. Well, let's talk about ideas, because a big thing that I took from this book was that he was very, very strong about how all the ideas and the early versions of the stories that they created sucked, and they were ugly, and didn't work and didn't kind of fit together properly, but there was kind of a faith within the company that you work on them iteratively and they become beautiful. And that's something that isn't really modeled to us generally, I think, but seems to be true throughout art and just talent in general. I just imagine someone, or writing, for example. Like I imagine J.K. Rowling just sitting there just writing out Harry Potter word by word and not doing 12 edits and planning it beforehand.
Or being rejected from
where it's going to go.
Yeah, being rejected from like 30 publishers or whatever it was.
Yeah.
You never hear about the grueling struggle that happens. Or you don't hear about the failures, particularly for successful artists or successful people of any form. You rarely hear about the iterations after iterations after iterations of failures they've had along the way.
But to me, it's the iterations within the work that's interesting in this book, is that their whole process is surrounded around creating kind of a safe, trusting environment for people to share new ideas. And so there's no uncertainty. You know that you're allowed to do that and then they not work out. But you need to be really honest with each other and don't worry so much about calculatable returns all the time. There is a part of that, but not as much in other organisations. They've got this system and process that lets people be creative, come up with new ideas. Then in a supportive way, those ideas are made better through honest conversations, and then going back and making it better, and getting feedback, and then going back and doing it again and again and again. So much so that the budgets on these movies blow out quite a bit because they're always having to reanimate everything.
Yeah, I certainly know from my own experiences even in consultancy, and I know from some friends who work particularly in the creative consultancy space, which is, I was in management consultancy. They're in a more creative space in the management consultancy. When they're going to do a innovation or creative storming session, they basically remove the backstop of time off the back of the meeting or the workshop. So, they might say, we're going to start our meeting at 2 p.m, but you guys need to commit that you're not going to have to leave in 1 hour's time or 2 hours time. We're here until we've generated what we need to generate today. We're providing the space. And that's a pretty interesting concept. And it's certainly something that doesn't mesh too well into what we see as the corporate way of life.
I think it needs to be modelled from the top too. You got to see the people at the top make those mistakes. And I think that's something that they do at Pixar pretty well, with John Lasseter and everybody at the kind of high-end creative.
Yeah, well, and those guys are very much on the ground, They're in the mix.
Yeah, they're in the trenches.
Yeah, and I think that's super important and something that gets drummed into certainly what our career paths were originally in the engineering space, mate.
Yeah, so it's definitely strongly encouraged to
I think
spend time on site.
When you say strongly encouraged, I think you mean forced.
Forced, mandatory is that you have to go and experience it on the ground, and that's integral to your learning, and people won't respect you if you haven't been out there and done it yourself. It's kind of part of the culture. I think it's a very Australian thing, actually.
But I suspect that's the case everywhere too. You know, I would suspect that over in the States or over in the UK, if you've come out of graduated, you come out, the first thing you're doing is you're being on the site. I think some of my colleagues from Ireland, at least, they started out as, there's this idea of like starting out as surveying. They do a lot of surveying. Initially.
Yeah, that happens in England too.
Yeah.
But I think that you know, tall poppy syndrome's an Australian saying, and you know, people. There's a great quote from this book, To Brook, written by Peter Fitzsimons, about the Australians fighting alongside the English and others in World War II in Tobruk, and they held off the Germans, and it was this kind of famous story. Now, there's probably a lot of propaganda in this book, I felt, reading it, but it was a really good, interesting read. And
don't let that get in the way of a good story, though, mate.
That's right. So there's a story in it that I seem to have stuck with me, where there's a bunch of Aussies digging trenches in the hot Egyptian sun, and they're, you know, all there with their shirts off, with shovels, just middle of the day, sun beating down, and this bunch of English soldiers walks up, including this captain, and he's pristinely dressed, you know, with all the bells and whistles, you know, ironed everything, you know, fully decked out.
I actually thought there was like a brigade of captains, you know. There's like a few of them.
Well, I think there was this one particular one who came up and said, you Australians, you know, they just kept digging as these English people walked past. And one of the captains goes, hey, you salute us, you know. We are your superiors. You know, you must follow the chain of command. And one of the Aussie guys puts down his shovel, gets out of the thing, goes and grabs his shirt, slowly puts it on, and he's the major of the Australian whatever, brigade or whatever. And he says, you know what? You salute me because I outrank you, you know.
Well, I didn't think you'd say
sir.
that. I think you'd just put his shirt on and say, how about you salute me? And then probably take it back off and get back on the shovel.
Well, that's what the story is that he said, you know, piss off, and then he took his shirt off and kept digging. And that's kind of the story that is part of the Australian culture, that we like to think that kind of thing happens and everyone's in there together. Yeah. I think that's part of the Pixar culture.
Yeah.
That they all chip in, and they've all been part of story making in the past. So.
Well, all the you know, when the leadership is on board like that, you know, the people around them feel the buy-in. You know, they feel the energy. They're committed to the energy. So it's wholly important.
Absolutely.
Just before we move on, mate, I did want to touch on something in just how important iterations are. It was a little Twitter post I saw the other day, and by Ryan Stevens, and he said that Picasso created more than 50,000 works of art. How many are considered masterpieces that we still admire today? You know, maybe 100. Less than 1% of his creations are still relevant or even known about today. So stop trying to be perfect. It's a numbers game. Start creating and be courageous enough to share.
That's pretty cool, because that certainly is part of the journey I'm trying to go on at the moment, is learn to share and I've started doing more writing, and I've been pretty hard on myself, kind of like, this is no good. But then this one particular article I've been writing about how to get better at your work, I've done a few edits of and kept writing it, and I'm trying to write on it 10 minutes a day, and I've noticed the quality of it has obviously gotten a lot better as I've been editing and rewriting these certain passages and adding new things in. And again, why am I surprised about that? I kind of know, but I think you don't really know until you do it. And you've just got to keep going, and hopefully we can. This podcast is a bit like that. We're practicing, so
yeah,
we've just got to keep doing it.
I think it's if you say you've been doing some writing for this year, pretty religiously. If you back then looking at, say, the writing that you're doing now, you wouldn't think that you were capable of doing that writing, so you probably wouldn't start, or you wouldn't bother. Or you wouldn't think that you had the creative nous to be able to come up with something like that. I actually look at some things that I've even written in the past, and I still think, I'm like, not to say that they're very good, but I was like, oh, I can't believe I came up with that, or where did that idea come from? Or that's interesting.
It's
good. Almost like there's a self-doubt, and so because we can't get it right, maybe the first time round, we hesitate to start the journey. And it's all about hitting the iterations. And certainly back in my glory days on YouTube, when I was making some commentaries and things, episode 1 was so far different from what episode, 50 was and beyond. It just kind of develops and grows and evolves, depending on what people enjoy, depending on what feels right, and depending on where you want to take it.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so I think that's the critical thing here, mate.
Yeah, we'll put up the link to your YouTube in the show notes.
I think we'll spare everyone that.
First person that finds it wins a prize.
Lockie's shouting.
So candour's pretty important to him too, isn't it?
Well, I think we've touched on that as well. I think that's kind of been glistening its way through. Is you can't possibly do some of these things without candour and the openness that goes with it.
Well, that's how you get the iteration. I mean, he calls they hold special meetings to be candid. And that's something that I think works. I know my brother was telling me on the ship he was recently on, he's in the Navy. I think I've talked about him before on the podcast. The recent ship he was on, his captain held a meeting every Tuesday where everyone would sit, all the officers would sit down and tell each other what pissed each other off about things. It was just this 1 hour meeting where you could say whatever you wanted. And it wasn't that you couldn't say whatever you wanted outside of that, but the captain made space for strong opinions, honesty, non-emotional kind of, this is how we get better sort of, if you're not doing this well, et cetera, et cetera. And it went always, and that's hard in the military.
Particularly the hierarchical nature of it. I'm genuinely surprised that kind of actually went on. But I think
apparently it worked excellently.
Yeah. But I think the key is those, in the case of your brother and in the case of these meetings that they have at Pixar, it's not a complaining session. It's not to complain.
No.
So complaints are just, they're just the same thing as not saying what you really mean, because all that's behind them is some egotistical agenda. And so it's about being really open and genuinely critical in the pursuit of the overall mission.
Constructive.
Yeah, it's constructive.
So they call these meetings the Brains Trust, and they have them that review all the movies as they're going along. And everyone sits around and talks about what could be better about this or that particular scene. And the directors of the movies bring in the different parts that they want to work on.
And it's not that innovative of a concept in terms of a governance, because all that Brains Trust is basically a steering group. Yeah, it's a project control group. But
I think it's different because it digs into the ground level.
I was going to say, but what?
Sorry.
Yeah,
I interrupted you.
But what they actually do and how they conduct the particular project control groups, if you will, getting very clinical on it, is different, I would suspect, from many project control groups that I've been in, for example, where quite often there's too many agendas and people aren't leaving things at the door, or people are trying to find an easier way out of something.
Is it because there's no clear objective as such? Like, I imagine these, it's like, make this scene better is the one objective of that meeting. But some of the governance stuff that I've been involved in is kind of very high level, You're kind of looking at the overall picture.
Yeah, maybe there's
I don't know.
Maybe there's too much involved. You're looking at too broad a brush of the entire thing, and so, which is quite interesting, because what actually tends to happen in those type of meetings is, because you're, say, presenting the entire status of the whole project at one point in time, people get caught up in an issue. For example, you had an issue for the last period of time, and people become so consumed by that one issue, but across the entire space of the project, it's meaningless, and it's going to result in meaningless things, rather than focusing on how we can maybe improve or construct or do something better. And I see that as people just wanting to exert some authority and people wanting to push some sort of agenda quite often. And I think that's maybe where it falls down. Whereas in the case of the Brains Trust, the whole idea is to leave all that, at the door, which is a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
But they're trying to create a safe space to do it.
And the other interesting thing about this is it wasn't just a once off. So Ed and John took over Disney. When Disney bought Pixar, they actually Disney said, we want to replicate Pixar's, we'll keep you as a separate company. We want to replicate Pixar's culture within the Disney animation studio. And they went over there and basically used these same principles and fixed Disney, and they've made lots of hits from that point on, because they've kind of used these ideas and this structure. It's really the thing that really strikes me about this book is it's super interesting how they're able to create a structure for creativity.
Yeah, and that's why I think that, as you said at the start, that motto, which is story is king, trust the process. Or maybe it should be flipped around the other way. It should be trust the process, but story is king. It's kind of,
but yeah,
they've created this process, which is usually associated with being a limiting thing, but have allowed it to help with something that allows for something that requires space, which is creativity.
Yeah,
and that's just very, very impressive.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on about the book?
Well, so this Brains Trust idea, which is basically a steering group for the movies, which is established at the start, right? And it's this opportunity for people to come forward and talk about things in a non-mandatory way. It's not a way to push the blame onto people. I saw it exactly the same as Monday Notes, which we spoke about, I think, in an earlier episode. Might have been episode 6 with Range. And this is where Werner von Braun, he was at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And they used to have this thing with Monday Notes where they basically would, all the engineers would submit to him, some of the issues and problems that they were facing, just the major problems that they were having. And he would basically go through all these notes, he's being the central point, mark them up and put a few different comments and things out, and then distribute them out to the entire company, right? Or distribute them out to everyone that was able to see them. And they were able to unblock so many problems that they were having. What happened?
Problem shared.
Yeah, problem shared, and many minds coming together to solve problems in slightly different domains, maybe, a bit of domain analogous thinking. So the subsequent, leader came in to Warner Van Braun and basically turned that from a communication tool into a hierarchical tool. And so it became a bit more of a blame game. And whilst obviously the guy that, was the successor, was a brilliant engineer, he was renowned as being a, shoot the messenger type guy. And so it became this form of compliance. It was mandatory, and problem after problem after problem mounted, and just was not being solved in the same way, fashion, and changed the entire culture of the centre, which is quite interesting. I'm sure this isn't the sole issue, but that was a big thing.
Yeah, that's really it's a good comparison because they are quite similar. So tell me what you're going to do differently after reading this book.
Big one for me was loosening the management reins. Right? I think, or certainly when I was getting started in the space, you want to just know everything that's going on. You micromanage, and allowing people, trusting in others to do good work is not just empowering for them, but it's empowering for you as well. And, if there's a problem with an outcome, considering it, a downfall on my half, not a downfall on their half. So I think that was part of it. Just removing some of the micromanagement to allow some of the, freer flowing things to happen. And that goes not just in the, one-on-one management, but that would be, from a meetings point of view, or from a, how do we run a particular project point of view? Let things kind of just loosen the shackles a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was one. And the next one, again, reinforced for me the importance of on-the-ground leadership. You can only do so much from the bloody control center of the office. You need to be in there, in the mix. And I recall when it might have been Elon Musk and Tesla, they were having a major issue go back a few years ago. And he basically set up a desk in the middle of the manufacturing plant for himself and just sat there for the next several months or whatever it was. And was able to work through and resolve things. So that was just another, tick in the box for how important that on the ground leadership is, and the humility that comes with it.
Yeah, that's huge. That's really good. Not easy either.
No.
Yeah.
And what about you, mate?
So for me, somewhat similar, but I really took away that about creativity being as a system, create a structure for creativity, not only efficiency. So I think most businesses focus on efficiency and it's a worthwhile thing. But I think that there's a lack of balance between that and risk management is something that's kind of a bit overdone and it stifles creativity. So I really want to build that into the business that I'm a part of. And I had a couple of quotes that kind of stuck with me to kind of remind me about what to do. And Ed says, at Pixar, we start with the assumption that our employees are smart, creative people who want to contribute. Next, we also assume that our company is getting in the way of their creativity and try to fix it to remove these impediments. That is awesome, I reckon.
I was going to say, mate, that is like, it's not we're pushing you in a particular direction. We're just getting the things out of your way. You know, we're removing the boundaries so that you can just keep running.
Yeah. And he doesn't mean, hang out and think all day. He's just getting that balance in a bit more of a, and the second quote kind of talks about that. He says, you must loosen the reins, not tighten them. They must accept risk and trust the people they work with and do everything to eliminate fear. They being the people running the business. So make sure the people aren't looking over their shoulder, and let them, cap the downside of the mistakes they can make. So make sure you've got risk management for the really big things. But, let people use their brains.
Yeah. I think
makes them happy.
The fear, right? That fear is something that comes from that hierarchical piece.
Yeah.
And so eliminating that fear is done when people are, more freely able to express, what they think.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about it now, I think it's important to kind of define the things it's okay to make mistakes with and take risks on, and those that aren't.
Yeah.
Safety, those sort of things.
Well, there's,
you know what I mean?
We've been speaking about defense, and defense is the obvious example there, right? That is a place that, unfortunately, the strict process and the dutiful hierarchy needs to be in place because of the risk and the consequences that happen as a result of those outcomes. You cannot have people going into a particular war zone and deciding that they want to do something their own way or do something slightly different to what the routine is, because it won't just end up with themselves being killed, but potentially a whole raft of other people, and maybe even losing a battle or something,
So there's an interesting book that we might do on this podcast that I've recently read called Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal, and he talks about decentralizing the organizational structure of the Allied troops in the war against ISIS. And that is a really interesting read about kind of the dichotomy between traditional military top-down siloed leadership and what he created in Iraq to try and defeat a chaotic, unpredictable enemy. So that would be awesome as a segue from this. I wanted to share one more thing, that from this book I've written something I put at the top of my to-do list every day. And it says, design your day, design your week. Walk the shop floor, meet with the clients, meet with the staff. Move forward with the strategy and keep pursuing your blue sky projects, which is our innovation platform at FSC. Keep learning new things and build the machine of the business. So I think that's kind of the takeaway for me from this book, and I'm trying to do that as part of my week.
Well, mate, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up and summarize the whole book in. Is it one sentence? Did you push that into one sentence?
There's a lot of commas in it. No. So we might put that out there. We'll put it out as something on our Instagram or something like that. So.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, mate. That's a nice little way to finish.
Thank you. See you,
Cheers.
mate.